Welcome back to the Shed Manufacturing YouTube channel. In this installment, we'll be building this catch can and installing it into our project Turbo E30. Follow along, it should be a pretty fun build. Pretty much all fab projects for me start with a trip to the belt sander with a fresh belt on it to get all the tungstens all sharpened on both sides, ready to go. So that way I can just sit them at the fab table next to the welder, so that way I don't have to keep making back and forth trips every time I dip a tungsten. Here's a little sneak peek of all the bits and pieces we'll be using to make this all go together. All will be revealed as we go on. Whenever I go to make boxes, I always try and make them out of two pieces of metal. And I do what I call a clamshell, where I have two 90s in it, and then the other one has two opposing 90s in the long axis versus the short axis. And then you can have them clamshell together, and pretty much, if you have all your measurements right, you can have them just stick and hold together, so that way it's a little easier to get them positioned to do all your welding. Here you can see me absolutely forgetting how far my bracket machine will go, which is just a modified 3 or 5 ton arbor press. So I wound up having to chop the end of it off in order to get that piece of aluminium in there. Not one of my proudest moments, I will admit. Then it's straight over to the Pexto, which is a big stomp shear that I got a little while ago, and absolutely would recommend if you ever want to do any kind of sheet metal fabrication. Makes perfectly square, perfectly straight cuts every time. And then that is just a arbor press with a set of jaws for a regular bench vise, only converted with a little bracket I made to sit in the arbor press, which makes bending little brackets really, really quick. And you'll see me get to make this part twice because I didn't measure well enough to account for the diameter of the bends. So you'll see it's just a really poor fit, and I'll have to remake one of the other clamshells here in a minute. Yeah, you can see I've found the error of my ways, realized how poor that fit was, and then decided to waste a little bit more material to get it right. This machine will make the cut exactly where you want it, but if you mark it wrong or guess wrong, it makes the wrong cut. And the new one fits much nicer around it. Can be a little bit tricky to get together, but that thing fits like a glove. We'll get the corners sanded down and then start work on the internal structures. So here we are getting the corners of it all sanded down, so that way they'll interface with the bends on the inside of the clamshells respectively. So once we get these all brightened up after getting the marks out of the bracket machine, we will start work on the inner baffling structure. So a catch can has to be able to get the oil-laden air coming out of the breather of the engine, filter it through some media of your choosing, and then vent it out the top through a filter. I chose to steal some stainless steel scouring pads from the kitchen. Hope Simone doesn't mind. Sorry. Here I am just getting them all opened up, and you see that that strip will become the divider. So the thing you'll need with the divider is A, to keep the filter material, which is our scouring pad, on one side, and B, to try and keep it as much out of the base of the catch can as possible, because that's where all of the condensation and oil-laden air will be depositing all of that. So as you see, I made a nice little bend to keep it up as high as possible. And now we go to one of my favorite tools. It's a hole punch used for mostly doing sheet metal work where you need to do a bunch of spot welds. But I found it was just a really quick way to put a lot of holes into a piece of metal really, really quickly. We then go to the drill press to get the rest of them on the inside done, because obviously it doesn't have a whole lot of reach with the jaws that it has. But you want this section to flow really well, because you don't want to create any internal restriction that would cause the air to, instead of going through the breather, to try and go through like a front main seal or a rear main or a pan seal and start making the engine leak. So a lot of flow through the catch can is important. So here we get the material. That's where the filter will sit up top. With the other side of the clamshell up top, we have the entry for the gases coming from the engine, and that hole at the bottom where my hand is will be where the petcock and the drain is. All we have to do now is start welding, really. Now this internal baffle only has to be held in place. It doesn't have to be sealed. It doesn't have to be airtight, because remember, all we're doing is trying to separate the air, and it's going to have air flow through it. And as long as most of the air flows through that panel where we drilled all those holes, we'll be right as rain. So all of this only really has to be held into place, not really actually sealed or anything like that. Here we are welding the bungs into the sheet metal. This is an area that I still really struggle with fabrication, because you have a really thick structure, which is the bung. The aluminium built up there is really thick, and you're trying to weld that to a really thin piece of sheet. And not to mention the space constraints. You can see me bending TIG wire around to get to the back of it. None of these welds are really pretty, and I know that, and I got the metal a little hot on the other side, but it's a valuable practice that I don't really get anywhere else. The one up top doesn't really have to be sealed, but the one at the bottom absolutely does, which is why I was even more irritated that I burned through at the very first arc strike. We get it back, it just takes a little longer. I had the amperage set too low, which is an odd way to think about it, but I wasn't able to get enough heat into the bung before I got too much heat into the sheet. So interestingly enough, you'll overheat a piece of material with not enough amps because you aren't able to do the work quickly enough. And that's sort of something that's taken me a little while to get my head around. But here we go, trying to build that ridge up slowly with just a little bit of pulse on the pedal, just to try and give us something to sand back down to get a good seal again. Would have taken less time if I'd just done it right the first time, but here we are. I didn't actually show it, but I've made a pretty boneheaded move here. And you'll find out that I've made this move in probably just a few minutes. So the way I weld this up is I clamp, I make a little tack, and then I move around. That's because the aluminum that we use, it's thin, it's sheet, and as a result it warps a lot with heat input. And so if you don't move around and put a little tack on different corners, you will wind up basically having something that fits beautifully on one side and has like a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch gap on the other. So we get the top of this all welded up, and then I realized that I've forgotten to put all of the scouring pad material in it and have to weasel my way in there in order to squeeze it in. And here we go. I realized the error of my ways and now have to spend probably 4 times as long squeezing this material in as it would have taken if I just put it in the first place before I welded the top together. But you know, you don't learn a whole lot from winning everything, and I'll definitely probably not do that again. But we got it all in, all the materials where it should be, and now it's time for just a welding montage as I clamp this thing and go around putting little caterpillars all over it. Fixture holding is probably one of the most time-consuming parts of what I do in the shop. I wind up spending, it feels like, a decent majority of my time in here just figuring out ways to hold pieces of metal together before I've welded them. So far, the best conclusion I've come to is I just need more people. If I could just have 2 to 3 people just hold all of my things for me while I weld them, I'd be in a lot better place. But as it is, I get clamps. So I didn't do a good job of filming the way I'm going to be mounting this, but the E30 has a little bracket at the bottom that was meant to hold the OEM air intake, but I can use that to create a piece that the catch can slides down onto that locates it in one direction, and then I make a Z-shaped tab for the top that will capture one of the bolts for the cruise control module. So it'll be one bolt, but it'll be located with 2 pieces. So it's a really nice, simple way of getting it to slot in and not need a whole lot of bolts and unbolts, and its access is right up at the top. So I'm pretty proud of it. It sits in really nice and snug without any bolts, and once you put a bolt in, it's really secure. As you can probably tell, I'm not very patient, so I had to use a set of adjustable wrenches to get it in there because I couldn't wait for it to cool off enough. So now we use my favorite technique of finding where the bolt center goes, which is just hitting the outside of it with a hammer, because it leaves a little indentation right in the middle of where you need the new hole. So we get that tapped in, pull it out, drill it, and sand the corners down. Yeah, still hot as anything. Smooth. Now it's time for final assembly, where we put some thread sealant on the stuff at the bottom where it's going to be submerged in liquid, and then get the filter squeezed into the top. And then final install with a Shed MFG sticker. By the way, if anybody wants a Shed MFG sticker, go ahead and say something in the comments, and I'll try and get them out to you.